What's going on, everybody? I'm Jody. This is Inspire Woodcraft. Today we are making a sanding station. So this project uses like half a sheet of plywood with waste left over, so you're not using very much materials. I got my plywood from a local home center and I had them rip it down into 2 foot by 4 foot sections. Now I took one of those pieces and I made my first cut at 18¼ inches. Then I made another cut at 16 inches. I set the blade to about 1/8 of an inch high and set the fence at 3/4 of an inch. Now I took that 2 foot by 18 inch piece and I started running grooves. Each time I ran a groove, I would extend the fence by another 3/4 of an inch, make another groove, extend the fence, so on and so forth, up to 14 slots. I moved the fence back to 3/4, added about 3/32, and then did the exact same thing. Now of course, my plywood was cut out of square. I made a T-square style router jig. Really good for squaring up panels and for routing dados and grooves. I made a separate build video on that. If you guys want to check that out, I'll link it at the end of the video and down in the description. So next I made a mark at 4.5 inches. I routed a 3/4 inch groove, 1/4 inch deep. Then I got smart and I used a piece of plywood to determine the width, and I plowed one more groove with the router on that last table saw groove that I'd made. Back of the table saw, I cut that 16 inch piece and I cut the grooved piece down to 9 inch sections. This would give me 2 tops and 2 sides. I measured in 1 inch from one of the ends of the sides and used plywood again to establish my groove. I measured 11¼ inches from that mark and I routed both sides the same. I cut 2 pieces 11.5 by 9 for the main dividers, and then I cut table saw grooves again at 3 3/4 inch from both sides, using the same method we used in the beginning. Now I dry fit everything at this point just to make sure it was all gonna fit together snugly. I assembled the top, bottom, and dividers using wood glue and 1.5 inch 15 gauge finish nails, squaring everything up as I went. Now while I set that aside to dry for a little bit, I moved my attention to the sides. I laid out all the stuff that would go on one side. And when I got it just where I wanted, I penciled in where I would be putting dowels. Now I used a 3/8 inch drill bit in the drill press and set up to drill about half the thickness of the plywood. Now I laid everything out on the other side and did the same thing. When I got it all set up evenly, I made marks at 1.5, 4.5, and 7.5 inches, and then transferred my marks down. Now when I drilled this out, I still drilled 3/8 for the top holes, but in the bottom holes, I used an 1 3/8 Forstner bit where I'm gonna put a much bigger dowel. I marked the length of the dowels based on what was going on them. I used a bandsaw to cut the dowels and then cleaned up the ends with sandpaper. Now to install the dowels, I'm just gonna use CA glue or super glue. There's not gonna be a lot of weight hanging on these dowels, so I think super glue is gonna be just fine to hold these. I attached the sides using wood glue and finish nails just like I did before. I cut a piece the same overall dimensions as the back and ripped it at a 45-degree bevel, probably about 1/3 of the way over, to make a French cleat. And here I am installing the top part of that cleat on the back of it. I measured the holes for the dividers and shelves and cut them all at a 3/16 inch hardboard. I needed 13 dividers and 2 shelves. I ran a divider through each groove just to make sure I wouldn't run into any problems. Here I am cutting one corner off each divider. I used scraps and double-sided tape to make stop blocks and place them in the crosscut slit. This worked out really well for making repetitive cuts. Cutting off the bottom corners is going to allow me to get my fingers in between each one of the items that's on the shelf. I cut a small piece of plywood to fit just under the unit. This is where I'm gonna hang my Nyalox brushes. Now after placing them all where I wanted them, I went through and I marked the center of each one and then just went through and made sure they were all on the same plane. I drilled 1/4 inch holes for the flat brushes and slightly larger holes for the rest, based on the shaft design. Now I cut this piece pretty snug to fit in here. So to install it, I'm just gonna use wood glue in the middle and CA glue on the ends. I'm gonna use an accelerator to speed up the cure time of the CA glue. That's gonna act as a clamp, but I'm gonna use clamps anyways just to make sure it has a nice snug fit. So I went through and I sanded the pencil marks off the front, and then I cleaned up all the edges with 120 grit. So this is an old dresser I recently converted into movable tool storage. It's not my ideal place to mount this, but since I don't have any wall space right now, it'll have to work. I measured 16 inches down from the top and set up a cleat to rest the other half of the French cleat on. Then I pre-drilled and used 1¼ inch screws to fasten it securely to it. I went ahead and put 1 screw on the top just to lock it in, and now this thing's not going anywhere. Now I could put the shelves and dividers in and fill her up. things to bring up. Your dimensions might be different. If you build something just like this, you might want to adjust things accordingly based on the amount of product you have or plan on having in the future, and based on the size of that product. Now in the big dividers, these ones, I use that dimension based on a full sheet of sandpaper. Now there's narrower sandpaper, there's pre-cut sandpaper, there's different sizes. To prevent it from sliding all the way into the back, I took little 1/2-inch strips of the hardboard that I use for the dividers. I just took a measurement here and then subtracted that from 9. And that's the length that I cut the 1/2-inch spacers at. So then you can just slide these in and it'll hit that stop block and it'll keep everything lined up to the front of the sanding station. Now as far as making the narrow grooves in the plywood with the table saw, you could very easily do that with the router, but I didn't have a 3/16 inch bit, and a 1/4 inch bit was just a little too wide. It allowed for too much slop in there. I prefer using a straight bit and a router because it gives a nice clean pass and you don't get all the ups and downs that you sometimes get when you use a table saw. What? I use cheat sheets. Oh, it would be super helpful to have all this stuff on a cut list, which brings up 2 points. One, I don't have a cut list. I'm gonna do my best to list the dimensions down below, and if that helps anybody out, awesome. That being said though, if you have all your dimensions to begin with, you can cut all your plywood at once, all your hardboard at once, and it will make your production time a lot less. I kind of did this on the fly. It kind of progressed as I went, depending on what I really wanted to do. I have this light like creeping up on me. I apologize for the sun. That about wraps it up for this video anyways. Thanks so much for your guys' support. If you're new here and you got any use out of this video, subscribe, hit the little notification bell. I have a couple jig builds coming up. I have a really unique shop stool coming up as well, and that's gonna be a pretty fun build. So I think that about wraps it up for this. Again, sorry for the weird, it's the sun. Anyways, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.